The Victorian home, lavishly decorated, meticulously ordered, and emotionally charged, was more than a symbol of bourgeois respectability. It was a deeply psychological space, shaped by and in turn shaping the mental lives of its occupants. In a century marked by industrial upheaval, rigid gender roles, and an emerging awareness of the unconscious mind, the home became both a refuge and a repository of cultural anxiety. The domestic interior, far from being a passive backdrop to Victorian life, functioned as a coping mechanism for a society struggling to manage modernity, emotion, and identity. The rise of industrial capitalism in 19th century Britain created unprecedented shifts in how people lived and worked. Cities expanded rapidly, drawing labourers into crowded, unsanitary conditions, while the middle and upper classes retreated into increasingly ornate and controlled domestic environments. As art historian John Ruskin argued in The Stones of Venice, architecture reflected moral and spiritual values. In the Victorian domestic sphere, this took the form of rigorous order, symbolic separation from public life, and an idealised vision of home as a moral sanctuary. Rooms were delineated by strict purpose and gender, studies and libraries for men, drawing rooms for women, reflecting a broader cultural tendency to compartmentalise life, emotion, and social function. This spatial ordering mirrored the broader ideological division between public and private spheres, a central tenet of Victorian middle-class identity. The domestic sphere was constructed as the realm of purity, emotion, and moral influence, particularly the influence of women. Victorian interiors were famously dense, layers of wallpaper, heavy upholstery, ornamental objects, and shelves of sentimental memorabilia. While this has often been read as mere aesthetic excess, recent scholarship suggests it served a psychological function. In an era when emotional expression was tightly regulated, especially among women, objects became vessels of memory, grief, and personal identity. The rise in the popularity of mourning culture after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, championed by Queen Victoria herself, contributed to a broader culture of emotional containment through material possessions. Mourning jewellery and memorial art allowed for the sublimation of grief into socially acceptable forms. For example, here we see a portrait of Eugénie de Montijo, Empress of France, in mourning for her son. Here is an example of hair work, a popular keepsake in the Victorian era, where the hair of a loved one who had passed was used to make a decorative item that could be worn when in mourning. These objects offered a coded way to express feelings that were otherwise repressed under norms of stoicism and restraint. Among the most emotionally charged artifacts of Victorian domestic life was the post-mortem photograph, a striking practice that emerged as part of a broader 19th century culture of mourning. In an age when death was a frequent and intimate part of life, particularly in childhood, families turned to photography not merely as a tool for remembrance, but as a means of preserving presence amid profound loss. First introduced in the 1840s with the advent of photograph technology, post-mortem photography quickly became common across both Europe and North America. These images, often staged with extraordinary care, depicted the deceased posed as if asleep or, even more hauntingly, alive. Children were placed in cradles or their mothers' arms. Adults were propped in chairs or posed with open eyes artificially painted onto closed lids. The aim was not morbid spectacle, but emotional continuity, to fix the loved one in time, to resist the finality of death, and to create a tangible object through which grief could be both expressed and contained. From a psychological perspective, these photographs fulfilled multiple functions. First, they provided a socially acceptable outlet for grief in a culture that otherwise discouraged overt emotional expression, especially among men and the upper classes. In contrast to contemporary norms of silence around death, the Victorian home made space, however ritualized, for emotional commemoration. Second, they acted as a form of transitional object, as described by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, which helps mourners navigate the psychological realm. These images bridge the gap between presence and absence, as well as attachment and loss. Furthermore, post-mortem photography reflected the Victorian era's ambivalence toward death and memory. On the one hand, it demonstrated technological mastery over mortality. Photography, a modern medium, was used to capture and eternalize the most ancient of human experiences. On the other, it revealed a culture deeply anxious about the erasure of identity and death. The photograph served as a visual and material anchor, warding off not just loss but oblivion. These photos were often displayed within the home, placed in albums, lockets, or framed on mantels. In doing so, they were folded into the aesthetic of domestic space, further blurring the boundary between life and death, memory and presence. The Victorian home thus became a curated, emotional archive, its objects heavy with unspoken feelings, its walls hung not just with portraits of the living, but echoes of the departed. Post-mortem photography was more than a mourning practice. It was a deeply psychological act of emotional preservation, a form of containment in both the physical and affective senses. Like the Victorian home itself, it was an effort to impose order and intimacy on the inescapable chaos of loss. Indeed, this form of emotional containment bordered on what we might today recognize as a kind of psychological hoarding, not merely of things, but of unvoiced emotion. The visual and material saturation of the Victorian home thus becomes legible as a response to emotional inarticulacy, a spatial and aesthetic compensation for psychological silence. The ideal of the angel in the house, a term popularized by Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem, epitomized the Victorian ideal of femininity, selfless, pious, nurturing, and confined to the domestic sphere. Women were tasked not only with creating a peaceful, morally elevated home, but with embodying it. When women deviated from this ideal, whether through fatigue, anxiety, or sexual frustration, their distress was often medicalized. Female hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis, encompassing everything from depression to rebellion against domestic expectations. The medical establishment, led by figures such as Silas Weir Mitchell in the United States and Jean-Martin Charcot in France, often pathologized women's behavior while ignoring the psychological toll of their confinement. Mitchell's rest cure, for instance, famously applied to writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, became emblematic of how the medical system silenced rather than treated women's suffering. As historian Elaine Showalter has argued, the Victorian home functioned as both the stage and the source of women's emotional labor, a paradox in which the very space designed to protect mental well-being often undermined it. The Victorian age is often remembered for its emotional restraint, a stiff upper lip masking inner turmoil. But it was precisely this repression that helped birth the modern psychological model. In the late 19th century, figures like Freud began to articulate a theory of the unconscious. The idea that feelings, memories, and desires could be hidden from conscious awareness but still exert profound influence. The metaphor of the Victorian home, orderly, compartmentalized, and replete with locked doors and hidden drawers, resonated deeply with early psychological theories. Just as the home presented a facade of propriety while concealing emotional complexity, so too did the mind, in Freud's view, maintain the illusion of control while harboring repressed thoughts. The spatial logic of the Victorian house, its formal rooms, private quarters, and hidden compartments, mapped uncannily onto emerging models of the psyche. The Victorian home was not merely a site of domestic life. It was a symbolic structure, a space where the pressures of modernity, gender, and emotion converged. Through its architecture, rituals, and material culture, it both reflected and regulated the mental lives of its inhabitants. The emphasis on cleanliness, order, and emotional restraint can be read not just as a cultural preference, but as a psychological defense, a way of coping with the contradictions of an era that prized morality but repressed desire, that valued duty but denied interior life. As we reconsider mental health today through more compassionate and expansive frameworks, the Victorian home stands as a poignant historical lesson that beneath even the most elegant interiors, unresolved tensions may dwell.